Alright, so today we're just going to be covering just only about a half a dozen slides here for this part of the lecture. So it's part 2 of the pre-algebra. Alright, so basically this slide is just talking about how we need to isolate the variable. And the variable here is y. Okay, and remembering that we need to treat basically both sides of the equation the same. So whatever you do to the left side, you have to do to the right side. So as we see, this is y divided by 2. So in order to get rid of the 2, we need to multiply both sides by 2. So on the left side, we multiply by 2. That will get rid of, that'll cancel out the 2 there and leave just y on the left side. And then on the right side, then we take the 3.8 and multiply it by 2 also. Alright, some of the probably the trickier parts is the last part of this unit. Again, this is unit 9, is trying to write an equation for the word problem. And really paying close attention to the wording is going to help you. You have to try to figure out what you are trying to solve for, and then what is the action that you're trying to do to get there. So for example, it's asking us here if a patient's pulse decreases by 8 beats, it'll then be 78 beats per minute. So how many beats a minute is the pulse before the decrease? Okay, so we need to figure out pulse, okay, before the decrease. So I chose the variable p for pulse to represent pulse, and so the pulse has to decrease by 8, so that's going to tell me I'm going to minus 8. So p, some number, minus 8, then equals 78. I think that's probably the trickiest part of the equation, is just trying to write out the equation. And then again, you have to treat both sides of the equation the same. So in order to get rid of basically that negative 8 on the left side of the equation, I would have to add 8. And so that cancels out the 8, and so that leaves just p on the left side, and then I would have to add 8 to the 78, which would give me 86. And then, you know, I think it's always helpful, does that make sense? Okay, does that make sense that if the patient's pulse decreases by 8, it will be 78? So kind of put your number back into the equation to say, does that make sense? So if you had a lower number, for some reason, if you decide to do p plus 8, okay, on the left side of the equation, then your answer then would be 70 on the right side of the equation. Or no, yeah, it would be 70 because you would, you'd minus, yeah, because you'd have a plus on the left side. Yeah, then you would minus, and then that doesn't really fit with what it's asking. So pay really close attention to page 213 in your textbook, and it kind of gives you some examples of how to set up the equation based on the wording. So one of the examples is some number n, being represented as your variable, increased by 2.7. So that would look like n plus 2.7. 9 less than some number, that number being x, so x minus 9. Okay, so just read through those and study those, and those will help you set up your equations, because for your homework, that is definitely part of your homework, and that would be on page 219 and 220. 1 through 10, you have to do that. It's kind of a two-step thing. You're actually setting up the equation, and then you're solving for it. So like an example of 4 times the sum of 3 numbers, what does that look like? So it would be, if your numbers were x, y, and z, let's say, you would have x plus y plus z, that in parentheses with a 4 in front of it. Okay, and those, like I said, those examples are right in your textbook. Alright, and again, make sure you're reading your questions thoroughly, as far as sometimes like this particular one's a little bit tricky, because it's just not asking for this. There's almost like 2 parts of this question. Okay, so you have a cost of a dental crown being $1,200. The insurance pays a half of it plus $50. What part of the bill is left for the patient to pay? So you have $1,200 divided by 2, that gives you $600, plus the 50. Okay, so $650 is what the insurance is going to pay. However, what part of the bill then, the remaining part of the $1,200 bill, is what the patient has to pay. So if the insurance is going to pick up $650 of that $1,200, you're going to have to subtract $650 from the $1,200, and that would give you $550. So that is what the patient has to pay. So just make sure you're reading through the whole entire question, because there's a couple of them that are like that. They kind of try to trip you up. So they give you part of the information, you have to continue on to solve the rest of it. Alright, so this comes from page 213. So I just kind of changed the wording. This is one of your questions on page 2. Did I say 213? I mean 219. So Diane has 7 more patients to care for than Juan. If Diane has 18 patients to care for, how many does Juan have? So the first thing I'm going to do is set up the equation. I'm going to make the number of patients that Juan has, I'm going to represent that with X. Okay? And it says that Diane has 7 more than Juan. So I'm going to say X plus the 7 equals 18, because Diane has 18 patients. Okay, so that's my first part. That's my equation. So then I need to move on then and isolate my X. So I have to treat again both sides the same. So to isolate my X, I'm going to subtract 7 from the left side. I have to do the same thing to the right side. So that leaves Juan having 11 patients. Okay. Okay, so a good review for this whole chapter, this whole unit, is going ahead and looking at pages 220 through 221. That's like a little unit review exercise, critical thinking with Pre Algebra Basics. So I would try working through all those problems by yourself first to see how you're doing, and always you can double check your answers in the back of the book. And like I've told the people in the tutoring sessions, you know, I want to see your work, but if you need to, if you're kind of hung up and you're not sure, you can use your calculator just to kind of do some of that basic stuff, so you're not like, you know, totally taxing your brain on some things that you just kind of need to double check. So that's okay to do that. Okay. So that's really basically it for today's lecture. You have an assignment that I posted for the rest of this unit, and then next week we'll start looking at ratio and proportions.